You pulled drowning strangers out of the water, but you couldn't even save this family. My sister said it across the buffet table, loud enough for the back row to hear. A serving spoon stopped halfway out of the potato salad. Somebody's paper plate folded in on itself. The whole pavilion went quiet. Not the polite kind. The kind where 40 people suddenly find their shoes very interesting, and nobody wants to be the next one breathing. She was talking about our mother's care. About the money. About who showed up and who didn't. She didn't know that 2 rows behind her sat a retired Master Chief who had spent 11 minutes in a December sea waiting for a helicopter, and that the swimmer who came down the cable for him was me. I wish I could tell you her words bounced off. They didn't. My right shoulder went cold. The old way, the water way, the way it goes before rain when the scar tissue remembers something the rest of me would rather forget. To understand why my own sister could look at me and see nothing, you have to go back to a kitchen in 1994, and a single sentence my father never took back. But first you need to know how I ended up standing in that pavilion at all. It was a Saturday in early October, in Astoria, Oregon, where the Columbia River gives up and pours itself into the Pacific. If you've never been, picture a town built on a hill that can't decide whether it belongs to the river or the sea. Fog that comes in like it pays rent, and the smell of creosote and low tide stitched into everything. I'd lived an hour south of there for most of my adult life. My sister Dana, no, I won't call her that. That's not her name. Her name is Lorraine. Lorraine had organized the gathering. A celebration of life for our mother, who had passed in August after a long, slow leaving. Lorraine called it a celebration of life, because that's what the funeral home brochure called it. I called it the day I finally stopped waiting. My name is Ada Calloway. I'm 51 years old. For 26 years I was an aviation survival technician in the United States Coast Guard, which is the long way of saying I was a rescue swimmer. The job is exactly what it sounds like, and nothing like what people imagine. People picture lifeguards. They picture a tanned kid jogging down a beach. What it actually is, most days, is a helicopter at 3 a.m, a hoist cable, a sea state that makes the aircraft buck like it wants to throw you, and a stranger somewhere down in the black water who has maybe 4 minutes of useful consciousness left before the cold takes their hands, then their judgment, then them. You learn the math early. In water that's 8 degrees Celsius, call it 46 Fahrenheit, the Oregon coast in winter. A healthy adult has maybe an hour before unconsciousness, less if they're panicking, and panic is the default. You learn that the cold doesn't kill people the way the movies say. It isn't dramatic. The body just quietly reroutes blood to the core. The fingers stop working, the shivering stops, and a strange warmth comes over them, and they start to feel almost peaceful right before the end. The peaceful feeling is the dangerous part. I've had people fight me in the water, because in their last clear minutes they decided they'd rather rest. That's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes the person you're saving is the one trying hardest to drown. I learned all of that. I got very, very good at it, and none of it ever made the slightest difference to Lorraine. Let me tell you how good. Because it matters later, and because I want you to understand the size of the gap between what I was and what my family decided I was. I made AST. That's the rate, Aviation Survival Technician, in 1998 after a school in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, with a washout rate that hovers around 50% some classes. They don't advertise that number. The training is built to find the exact place where your body quits and then ask you to keep going past it. There's a pool evolution where they bind your hands and your feet and put you in the deep end, and you have to do something called bobbing. Sinking to the bottom, pushing off, getting a breath at the top, sinking again, for what feels like the rest of your life. The point isn't fitness. The point is to teach your nervous system that panic is a liar. That the part of your brain screaming you're about to die is, in that pool, simply wrong. And you can learn to set it gently aside and keep working. I learned to set panic aside when I was 23. I have used that skill in 18-foot seas and in hospital waiting rooms, and, it turns out, across a buffet table in a pavilion in Astoria. Over 26 years I logged something north of 300 cases. Most were nothing. A stranded hiker, a kayaker who misjudged a tide, a sailboat with a dead engine and a frightened family aboard. A handful were the kind that visit you at 3 a.m. for the rest of your life. I have a distinguished flying cross in a drawer. I have have a shoulder that was rebuilt twice, and forecast weather better than the radio. I have two names I will not say out loud, the two I couldn't reach in time, because some nights the water wins and carrying that is part of the work too. None of that is bragging. I'm telling you because Lorraine summed all of it. The school, the 300, the drawer, the shoulder, the two names, into a single phrase she used at family dinners for 15 years. Ada's little swimming thing, the way you'd describe a hobby. Something a woman does to fill the time when she hasn't got a husband and kids to fill it for her. The kitchen in 1994. I was 19. I'd come home to tell my father I'd enlisted. Not the Navy, not the Army, the Coast Guard, which to a man like my father wasn't real military. It was, in his words, the people who write you a ticket for not wearing a life jacket. He was a longshoreman, 31 years on the Astoria docks, hands like cargo hooks, a man who measured worth in things you could lift. He looked at me across the linoleum and he said, "Lorraine's got a head for the family. You've just got a strong back. Try not to drown. Try not to drown." He laughed when he said it, so it wasn't supposed to hurt. That's the trick of it. The cruelest things in a family almost always come wrapped in a laugh, so that if you flinch, you're the one who can't take a joke. Lorraine was 22 and already working the front desk at the cannery office. She had the head for the family. I had the strong back. And somewhere in the years after, those two sentences hardened into a kind of law that everyone obeyed without ever saying out loud. Lorraine was the smart one. Ada was the strong one. Smart got you respect. Strong got you asked to carry things. I want to be fair to her, because this story doesn't work if she's a cartoon. Lorraine is not stupid, and she is not, in the ordinary sense, cruel. She stayed in Astoria. She married a good man named Carl, who fixes boat engines, raised two kids who turned out the kind, and she spent 15 years being the one who drove Mom to her appointments while I was on a cutter off Kodiak or training in a pool in North Carolina. That part is true, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. She did the daily work. The unglamorous, unending, thankless work of watching a parent come apart one small loss at a time. There is a real grievance under everything she said to me, and a person who pretends otherwise is lying to you. But here's what she did with that grievance, and this is the part that matters. She turned it into a story where I was the villain. The daughter who ran off to play hero for strangers while her own mother forgot her name. And the family, aunts, cousins, Carl's people, the whole web of them, took that story and ran with it, because it was simpler than the truth. The truth had too many parts. The story had a hero and a villain, and a tidy moral, and people will always choose the story. The there Lorraine kept measuring, the appointments, the drives, the casseroles, was the only kind of there she could see, so it was the only kind she counted. There were others she never counted. There were others she never counted, because they happened up current, where nobody saw me coming. There was the summer of 2019, when Mom's confusion first turned the corner from forgetful to frightened, and she started calling people in the middle of the night because she couldn't remember if she'd locked the door, if she'd ever had children, if the man in the photograph on the wall were her husband or her father. Lorraine was running on empty, and one night in July she called me on a satellite phone. I was forward deployed, I won't say where. Crying so hard I could barely make out the words, and what she said was, "I can't do tonight. I just can't do tonight." And I talked her through it from the other side of the planet, on a phone that cost $9 a minute, for 2 hours, until Mom went back to sleep. Lorraine doesn't remember that call. I've thought about why. I think it's because remembering it would mean I was there, and there was a load-bearing wall in the house she'd built. There was the long-term care insurance, which somebody had to fight through 18 months of denied claims and appeals and a hearing. And that somebody was me, on the phone in the blue hours before my shifts, because I knew how to read a denial letter and not take no from a system built to wear you down. 26 years of bureaucracy teaches you that, if nothing else. The money that insurance finally, grudgingly paid out went straight into Mom's care. Lorraine thinks it just came through. It came through the way a man comes up out of the water, because somebody wouldn't let go of the cable. And there was the visiting, which I did less than Lorraine and more than such a story allowed. I'd drive the 11 hours from the air station on a 72-hour pass, sleep 4 hours, sit with Mom so Lorraine could have a weekend she hadn't had in months, and drive back. I never made it a thing. That was my mistake, I see now. I'd swallowed the family law so completely. Lorraine has the head, Ada has the back. The back doesn't get to need credit. That I did the work the way I did everything, quietly from up current, where nobody saw me coming. You cannot complain that you were invisible when you spent your whole life perfecting the art of not being seen. So when Lorraine stood in that pavilion and said I was never there, she wasn't lying, exactly. She was telling the only truth she had access to, and that, I've come to believe, is the saddest sentence I know how to write about my own family. I flew in 2 days before the celebration of life. I should say drove. I don't fly commercial if I can help it anymore. Something about being a passenger in an aircraft I'm not working makes my hands want a job. I drove up Highway 101 with the ocean, on my left the whole way, gray and enormous and familiar, and I rehearsed being calm. I'd been to the house already, of course, for the funeral itself in August. This October gathering was the second act, the part where everyone comes back after the shock has worn off, and the will has been read, and the real feelings come out. My mother's estate was small. The house, worth maybe $300,000 on the Astoria market, a little savings. And one line in the will that had already started a fire before I arrived. The house went to Lorraine and a sum of money. $62,411, an oddly specific number that turned out to be the exact balance of a particular account, went to me. 62,000. Lorraine had decided this was an insult. Not to her. To Mom. She'd decided that Mom, in her confusion at the end, had been gotten to. That I'd somehow, from 1,000 miles away, manipulated a dying woman into carving out a chunk of cash for the daughter who was never there. I knew where the 62,000 came from. I'll get to that. It matters more than anything else in this story. And it's the one thing Lorraine never bothered to ask about. The celebration of life was held at the Maritime Memorial Pavilion, down by the river. A covered structure the city rents out, with picnic tables and a view of the working waterfront, and the big container ships sliding past close enough to read their names. Lorraine chose it. She said, Mom loved the water. Mom did not love the water. Mom was afraid of the water her entire life, which is its own small clue I should have read sooner, but I didn't, because by then I'd stopped expecting anything I knew about our family to be true. I arrived 15 minutes early. I always do. Old habit. In my line of work, being early is the difference between a brief and a scramble. I helped set up folding chairs. Nobody asked me to set up, because keeping my hands busy is how I get through rooms full of people who'd rather I wasn't there. I wore civilian clothes, slacks and a sweater the color of wet sand, and I'd put on a little makeup, which I've never been good at and always feel slightly costumed in. After 26 years in a flight suit and a dry suit, regular clothes never quite feel like mine. People trickled in. Cousins I hadn't seen in a decade who hugged me and said, Ada, wow. In the bright, surprised way you greet someone you've been told things about. Carl shook my hand and held the grip a beat too long, which was Carl's way of apologizing for a thing he wasn't allowed to apologize for. Lorraine's kids, Megan, who's 24 now and a nurse, and Tyler, 19, were genuinely warm, and that warmth was the only thing that got me through the first hour. And there was an old man I didn't recognize, sitting near the back with a cane hooked over the table edge, and a paper cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Big through the shoulders, even bent with age. Watchful in a way most people aren't. He nodded at me once, early, the way you nod at someone across a room you think you might know. I nodded back and didn't think about it again. Not then. The trouble started small, the way it always does. We were maybe 40 minutes in, plates loaded, people settling, when the first rung went under my foot. It came from cousin Denise, Lorraine's age, who'd had 2 glasses of the box wine and was feeling expansive. Ada, you never married, did you? All those years on the boats with all those men. She said it with a wink, like it was a compliment to my options. Bet you have stories. It's not really boats, I said. It's helicopters mostly. Helicopters. Denise turned to the table like I'd said something charming and slightly unbelievable. Listen to her. Helicopters. I let it go. Rung 1. You let it go. Then Lorraine's brother-in-law, a man named Greg who sells boat insurance and has opinions about everything that floats, leaned in. So what was it, guard situation? Like a lifeguard situation, or, he made a paddling motion with both hands, grinning. You actually in the water, or more of a, what do you call it, a coordinator role. In the water, I said. Huh. He nodded like he was being generous. Good for you. Good cardio. Good cardio. Rung 2. The thing about the latter is that each rung feels too small to die on. You'd look insane defending yourself over good cardio. So you smile and you take a role you don't want, and you butter it slowly, and that's the trap. Because small ones, you teach the table that the big one is coming, and nobody's going to stop it. What kept me upright through all of it was the warmth coming from the wrong direction. Tyler, Lorraine's 19-year-old, slid into the seat across from me with his plate and said, "Lo, just for me. Aunt Ada, is it true you have a DFC?" I looked up what that is. His eyes were bright. That's a really big deal. "It's a piece of metal in a drawer," I said, but it landed warm, and he grinned, and for a second the pavilion was bearable. Then Aunt Ruth, my mother's sister, 81 and sharp as a fish knife, asked me a normal question across the table. "Ada, honey, are you still doing the swimming? The rescue thing?" "I retired in the spring," I said. 26 years was enough. 26 years, Ruth said, genuinely impressed, and that was the wrong thing to be in front of Lorraine. Lorraine set down her fork. Not hard, just deliberate, the way our father used to, and I felt the temperature of the table change. 26 years of being somewhere else, she said. Light, almost teasing. While the rest of us were here. "Lorraine," Carl said quietly. "What? It's true. I'm not allowed to say a true thing?" She looked around the table, gathering her audience, and she had it, because everyone there had heard the story for years, and the story said she was right. I drove Mom to 41 appointments the last 2 years. 41. I counted, and Ada flies in for the funeral and gets $62,000. There it was, out in the open now. I kept my voice even. "Lorraine, this isn't the place. When is the place, Ada? You're never in the place. That's the whole point." She was warming up now, and the thing about a person warming up in front of an audience is they stop being careful. You know what your problem is? You spent your whole life being the big hero for people you never met. Strangers. You'd jump out of a helicopter for a stranger, but you couldn't drive up Highway 101 for your own mother. A few people made the small sounds people make when they're embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to stop it. Aunt Ruth looked at her lap. Carl looked at me with an expression that begged me to let it go. And then Lorraine did the thing that moved it from an old wound to something I couldn't walk away from. She turned to her son, to Tyler, who just sat across from me, glowing about a medal. And she said, in front of everyone, like a lesson she was teaching him, "This is what I mean, Tyler. This is exactly what I've been telling you. Don't grow up to be the one who's always somewhere else when it counts. Don't be your aunt." She said it gently. That was the worst part. She said it the way you'd pass down something wise. I watched Tyler's face go still. 19 years old, caught between the mother who raised him and the aunt he'd just decided was something more than the family said. He looked down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He couldn't. He was a kid and it was his mother, and the whole weight of the family's story was pressing down on the back of his neck. And I understood that. I did. But watching her use her own son to carry the story forward one more generation, that was the rung that broke. I should have let it go. I'd let 26 years of it go. But I was tired in my shoulder, and the fog was coming in off the river. And somewhere under the calm, I'd rehearsed the whole drive up. Something I'd been holding for a very long time shifted its weight. "I was there for Mom," I said. "You just never knew where there was." Lorraine laughed, and then she said it, the line that stopped the spoon over the potato salad. "You pulled drowning strangers out of the water, but you couldn't even save this family." And the pavilion went quiet. I want to tell you what that quiet felt like, because the quiet is the whole job. In the water, there's a particular silence right after a person stops fighting you. When they've gone limp in the sling, and you can't tell yet if it's because they trust you or because you're too late. You hold them and you can't know. That's the silence that filled the pavilion. 40 people not knowing yet if something had just died. My right shoulder was very cold. I didn't say anything. I've learned that silence has a way of making other people fill it, and they always fill it with themselves. So I let it sit, and into that silence from the back came the sound of a cane tapping the concrete floor, slow and deliberate, as a big old man got to his feet. "I'm going to need a minute of everybody's time," he said. His name was Wendell Pruitt. He was 78 years old. And before I tell you what he said, I have to take you back to a night 19 years earlier, because you can't understand the pavilion until you understand the water. December 2006. I was 32, stationed at Air Station Astoria, which is a real place. Coast Guard aviation has been flying out of the mouth of the Columbia since before I was born, Because the Columbia River Bar is one of the deadliest stretches of navigable water on the planet. They call it the graveyard of the Pacific, 2,000 ships and counting. The bar is where the river current slams into the incoming Pacific swell, and the water stands up into walls with no warning and no mercy. We trained for it knowing that some nights it would win. That December, a crab boat called the Marie Delphine, fishing vessels. They get women's names. It's a tradition older than anyone remembers. Lost steerage in a building gale and went over on the bar. 6 men aboard. The Mayday came in at 2:47 in the morning. I know the time because it's written in a log I've read more times than is good for me. We launched into a storm that the duty forecast had, with what I've always considered remarkable optimism, called marginal, 40-knot winds. Seas at 18 feet and building. The kind of night where the only thing more frightening than going out is the thought of the men in the water if you don't. There's a checklist for a night like that, and the checklist is the only thing standing between a rescue and 2 funerals. But before I ever hit the water, the flight mechanic ran the hoist. The pilot fought the aircraft into a hover. The books say can't be held in those winds. And the co-pilot ran the math out loud on my dwell time. How long I could be in 46-degree water before I became a second victim they'd have to come back for. The answer that night was not generous. Everything we did was built around a clock. Nobody could see, but everybody could feel. We found the Marie Delphine capsized, hull up, rolling in the breakers like something already dead. 5 of the 6 crew had made it into a life raft, a little canister of orange against all that black. The 6th had not. He'd been swept clear when she went over, and he was out there alone in a survival suit that I would only learn later had a tear in the left leg seam. A small thing, a flaw in a glued joint, the kind of defect that means nothing until it's the only thing that means anything. Water was getting in. The suit was rated to keep a man alive 6 hours. The tear cut that to 1, maybe less, and the radio chatter told me he'd already been in the water close to that. The flight mechanic put me in 200 yards upswell of him, so the current would carry me down onto him instead of away. People think the helicopter drops you right on top of the victim. It can't. The rotor wash would drive a half-drowned man under. So you get deployed up current and you swim the difference, and the difference that night was the worst 11 minutes of my professional life. I want to be honest about it, because people romanticize this work, and it does not deserve to be romanticized. Every third wave broke over me and drove me under, and I'd surface not knowing which way the aircraft was, just the strobe somewhere in the spray. The man was conscious but barely, and he'd reached the stage I told you about, the warm stage, the give-up stage, where the body has rerouted everything to the core and the brain has decided the cold is a blanket. He didn't want to come. He pushed my hands away. He kept saying something I couldn't hear over the wind and the rotors, and I had to get a rescue strap around a man who outweighed me by 80 pounds and did not, in that moment, want to be saved. You're trained for exactly this, and the training is the only reason I'm telling you this from a diner booth instead of from a plaque. You don't fight a panicking or surrendering victim head-on. They'll take you down with them, and then there are 2. You come from behind. You make yourself their decision instead of their enemy. I got behind him, got the strap under his arms, signaled the hoist, and we went up together, spinning, the wave tops flattening to white below us. In the cabin, his core temperature, once they got him to the hospital in Astoria, read at 28 degrees Celsius, 82 Fahrenheit. The textbooks call that zone the place where the heart can simply stop, where the rewarming has to be done slow and exact, or the rescue itself becomes the thing that kills him. There's a phenomenon called afterdrop. Cold blood from the limbs, washing back into the core as you warm the surface, dropping the heart's temperature even as you're trying to save it. It's why you handle a severe hypothermia case like spun glass. He coded once in the helicopter. The corpsman and I got him back, and I held his head while we did it. And I remember thinking, the way you think strange flat thoughts at the worst moments, that his beard had frozen. That man was Wendell Pruitt. Retired Coast Guard Master Chief, gone back to crab fishing because some men can't leave the water alone. He was the father of one of the other 5 we pulled out of the raft that night. He'd been out on his son's boat because the season was good and he missed it. I didn't know any of that in the water. In the water, he was just weight and cold and a heartbeat I was trying to keep. I didn't see him again after that night. You usually don't. The survivors go to the hospital, And you go back to the station and write the report and the next call comes. That's the job. You don't collect people. You let them go. So when Wendell Pruitt stood up in that pavilion 19 years later and tapped his cane on the concrete, I didn't recognize him. I'd seen his face for 11 minutes, in the dark, half-drowned, 2 decades before. He recognized me. He'd been recognizing me, he told me later, since the moment I walked in. He'd just been waiting, the way old sailors wait, to see if he was needed. "My name is Wendell Pruitt," he said to the pavilion. "Most of you don't know me. I knew Ada's mother a little, from church, and she invited me today before she passed, which is the only reason I'm standing in your family's business, and I apologize for it." He looked at Lorraine, not unkindly. That was the part that undid her, I think. There was no anger in it. "Ma'am, you said your sister pulled strangers out of the water, but couldn't save her own family. I want to tell you about one of those strangers." He paused, and his hand on the cane was not quite steady. On the morning of December the 8th, 2006, I was dying in the Pacific Ocean off the Columbia Bar. I'd given up. I'd reached the part where you stop being scared and you just get tired, and you decide the water isn't so bad. I fought the person who came for me. I have to live with that. I fought her, and she got a strap around me anyway, and she did not let go. The container ship slid past behind him, silent, enormous, its name in white letters none of us read. I found out 3 years later who it was. The Coast Guard doesn't make a habit of telling you. I had to go looking. And when I found out the swimmer on that hoist was a 32-year-old AST named Ada Calloway, I sat in my truck in a parking lot, and I cried like I have not cried before or since. He looked at me then, and his eyes were wet, and he wasn't ashamed of it. "I have 11 grandchildren, ma'am. 11, and every single one of them exists, because that woman you just called a stranger saver came down a cable into a sea that should have killed us both." Lorraine's face had gone the color of the fog. "So I'll tell you what I think a family is," Wendell said, gentle as anything. "A family is the people who'd come for you in the dark. I don't know what your sister did or didn't do at the appointments and the paperwork. That's yours, not mine. But I know what she's made of, because I'm made of it now too. Half of me's been Ada Calloway's since 2006. He sat back down slowly, with the care of a body that's been broken and rebuilt. "That's all. Thank you for the coffee." For a moment nobody moved. Then Tyler, 19, Lorraine's boy, the one who'd looked up what a DFC was, stood up at his table. He didn't make a speech. He just looked at his mother and then at me, and he said, "Mom, you always told us Aunt Ada left." His voice cracked on the last word, the way a teenager's does when he's trying very hard to be a man in a room full of adults. "You never told us she did that." And Aunt Ruth, 81 years old, reached across and put her hand flat on the table, the way you'd quiet a child or a congregation, and said into the silence, "I sat at this fam's dinners for 15 years, and I heard Ada's little swimming thing, and I never once said boo. Shame on me. Shame on all of us who laughed. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Lorraine. Your mother knew Lorraine. The night of that storm in 2006, your mother sat up till dawn with the radio on. I was there. She knew exactly what her daughter was doing in that water, and she never told you, because she was afraid if she said it out loud it would come true and she'd lose her like she's lost Sam. That was the first time the name Sam had been spoken at that table in 50 years. It went past Lorraine like a fish she didn't see. It would matter later, on the phone. It didn't matter yet. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count, and I always come back to the same strange fact. I did not feel triumphant. People expect that I would have. The big vindication. The witness rising. The sister silenced. The part where the music swells. But I told you at the start, this isn't that story. And here is where I prove it. What I felt, watching Lorraine's face fall, was something closer to grief. Because I understood, finally and completely, that the version of me Wendell had just described, the woman worth crying over in a parking lot, had never once been visible to my own sister. Not because Lorraine was wicked. Because the story she needed me to be left no room for that woman to exist. And no rescue, no witness, no 11 grandchildren were going to change a story she had spent 30 years building her own worth on top of. Here is the part the algorithm won't show you in the thumbnail, because it isn't satisfying, because it's true. After Wendell sat down, Lorraine did not break down and apologize. She didn't cry and embrace me and say she'd been wrong. That's the ending you've been trained to wait for. That's the ending I waited for, too, for 30 years. What she did was stand up, pick up her purse, and say, in a voice gone tight and small, "I don't know what that was supposed to prove. None of it changes that she wasn't here." And she walked out to the parking lot, and Carl gave me a look I'll carry the rest of my life. Half apology, half exhaustion, and followed her. Because that's what people do. Because that's what people do when the story they've built their life on cracks. They don't thank you for the crack. They grab the pieces and they hold them together with both hands. And they hate you a little for showing them the seam. For a while after, it got worse, not better. That's the part the tidy versions leave out. The confrontation isn't the end. It's where the real mess starts. The pavilion emptied out slow and strange. Half the family suddenly had somewhere to be. The other half came up to me one at a time, near the coffee urn, and said versions of the same thing. "That was really something, that man, the things you did." And then, almost without exception, a softening, a but. "But you know Lorraine's been under a lot of strain. But she did do all the driving. But family's family. Even the praise came with a leash on it." Aunt Ruth held both my hands in her papery ones and said, "Your mother knew, honey. Your mother always knew." Which was the kindest thing anyone said all day. And also, I understood, an admission that she had sat at 15 years of dinners and let Ada's little swimming thing go by unchallenged. The phone call started that night. Denise, performing concern. A cousin from Seaside who'd missed the whole thing and wanted the play-by-play like it was a bauble game. And at 9:40, Lorraine. I almost didn't answer. I answered. "You humiliated me," she said. "No hello. In front of Carl's whole family. You brought some old man to make a scene at Mom's memorial." "I didn't bring him, Lorraine. Mom invited him. He came on his own. He's a prop. You probably set the whole thing up." Her voice was shaking, and underneath the anger was something I finally heard for what it was: fear. "You always do this. You disappear for years and then you show up and you make everything about your big dramatic. Your medals and your helicopters and everyone's supposed to forget who actually showed up." I could have read her the note then. I had it in my hand, in the dark of my motel room, my mother's 3 shaking lines, for Ada. So one of us finally won against the water. I had the better story and I had the proof, and I could have ended the call by ending her. "Lorraine," I said, "what did Mom's brother's name used to do to her?" "Sam." "Do you even know what happened to Sam?" There was a silence on the line. What does Sam have to do with anything? She didn't know. Of course she didn't know. The smart one, the one with the head for the family, the one who did all the driving. She had never once asked our mother why she was afraid of the water. Because the story didn't require it. The story already had all its parts. "Nothing," I said. "It doesn't have anything to do with anything." "Good night, Lorraine." And I hung up, and I did not read her the note. And I want to be clear that this was not mercy in the warm sense. I was furious. My hand was shaking as bad as her voice had been. I didn't spare her because I'm good. I spared her because somewhere in that phone call I understood that the note wouldn't have reached her. It would have hit the story like a wave hits a jetty. And the jetty would still be standing in the morning, and I'd just have wasted the most sacred thing I owned on a sister who was already on dry land, insisting she wasn't wet. I want to tell you about the $62,000 now, because it's time, and because Lorraine hung up before she ever found out, and as far as I know, she still doesn't. My mother was afraid of the water. I told you that. What I didn't tell you is why. When she was 9, in 1953, her older brother, my uncle, a boy named Sam I never met, drowned in the Lewis and Clark River, the slow brown tributary that feeds the Columbia south of town. He went in after a dog. The dog made it. Sam didn't. My mother watched from the bank. She was 9 and she watched her brother go under 3 times, and she could not swim and there was nothing she could do. And she carried that to her grave 70 years later, and she never once, in my entire childhood, told me the story. I found out the year before she died. She was already losing words by then, already drifting, and one afternoon during a visit. Yes, I visited, not 41 times. I'm not going to pretend I matched Lorraine. But more than the story allowed, she looked at me with sudden frightening clarity and said, "I always wondered why you of all people. Why the water?" After Sam, and the whole thing came out, in pieces over an hour. She'd watched her brother drown, and then, decades later, her own daughter had grown up and walked straight into the thing that took him, on purpose, again and again, for a living. She told me she used to lie awake on the nights she knew there was a storm on the coast, that she'd never said anything. Because she didn't want me to feel her fear as a weight. That she'd been, the word she used was proud, but a frightened kind of proud, the only kind she had. I have to tell you how she said it, because it's the closest I ever got to my mother, and it happened when she was already half gone. She'd drift, mid-sentence, and lose the thread, and I'd wait, and she'd come back from wherever she went and pick it up a little further along. So the story arrived out of order, like wreckage washing up over a tide. She told me about the dog first. A brown mutt named Pal. She remembered the dog's name and not, that afternoon, my name, and how it was her fault. She'd thrown the stick. She'd thrown it too close to the water. She was 79 years old, and she still believed at the center of herself that she had thrown a stick in 1953 and killed her brother. She told me Sam went under without making any noise. That's the thing she could never get past. That drowning isn't loud. There's no thrashing, no calling out, none of what the movies promised a 9-year-old. He just got quiet, and then lower, and then he was a shape under brown water, and then he wasn't a shape at all. He didn't even fight, she said. Why didn't he fight, Ada? And I knew the answer, the cold answer, the one from the training, that by then the cold had him, that the quiet is the cold, that he almost certainly couldn't have fought if he'd wanted to, and I did not say one word of it. I held her hand and I lied. I said, I don't know, Mama. Some truths you carry so other people don't have to. She asked me, near the end of the hour, before she drifted off for good that day, whether the people I pulled out of the water ever said thank you. I told her the truth. Almost never. You don't usually see them again. She nodded like that confirmed something she'd long suspected about the shape of the world, and she said, Then who says it to you? And I didn't have an answer, and she fell asleep. And that was the most honest hour my mother and I ever had. The $62,000 was a life insurance payout. Not on her, on Sam. A tiny policy her parents had taken out on their children in 1950, the way poor families sometimes did, and after Sam drowned, the $1,100 payout sat in a passbook account. My grandmother could never bring herself to touch. And it moved to my mother when my grandmother died. And my mother could never touch it either, and it sat there for 60 years, gathering a little interest and a great deal of grief, until it was $62,411. She left it to me, the drowned boy money. She left it to the daughter who pulled the drowning out of the water. Because in the end, the only way she could make peace with Sam was to give Sam's money to the person who'd spent her life doing the thing my mother could not do at 9 years old on a riverbank. Saving the one going under, there was a note. 3 lines. In the shaky hand of the end, it said, For Ada. So one of us finally won against the water. Love, Mom. Lorraine thought I'd manipulated a dying woman. The truth is my mother and I had one honest hour in 76 years, and she used it to forgive herself, and I let her, and she paid me in the saddest money I have ever held. I never told Lorraine. I thought about it. I could have stood up in that pavilion after Wendell and read the note aloud and finished her completely. I had the better story and the witness and the note in my bag. I actually had it in my bag. I carry it. And I could have buried her in front of the whole family. I didn't. And not because I'm a saint. I'm not. I thought about it for a long, ugly minute. I didn't do it because I finally understood the thing my mother understood too late, on a riverbank in 1953. That some people are going under, and you can put a strop around them, and they will fight you, and they will push your hands away, and they will choose the cold. And the job is to save the ones you can reach. Lorraine was not in the water. Lorraine was on the bank, holding a story like my mother held that passbook, and you cannot rescue a person who is standing on dry land insisting they're not wet. So I let her go. Not the way you let go of someone you're hauling up a cable, the other way. The way my mother finally let go of Sam. I stayed in Astoria 3 more days. I drove out to the South Jetty alone one gray morning and sat in my truck and watched the bar do what it does, stand up into walls and fall back down, the most dangerous water I know. And I felt my shoulder go cold the old way, and for once I didn't mind it. The cold is just the body remembering. There are worse things to be made of than the memory of every person you wouldn't let go. I thought about Tyler out on that jetty. Not Lorraine. I'd made my peace, or the beginning of it, with Lorraine. Tyler. He'd texted me the night after the pavilion, a single line from a number I didn't have saved. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I didn't text back right away. I sat with it. Because here was the actual fork in the road, the one that mattered more than the money or the medal or the witness. A 19-year-old standing exactly where I'd stood in a kitchen in 1994, being handed a story about who in the family was worth something and who was just a strong back. The story doesn't end when you survive it. It comes for the next kid. It always comes for the next kid. I wrote back, "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself a better story than the one you got handed." Then I added, "Because I'm not made of stone and he's a good boy. The DFC's in a drawer in Coos Bay. Come see it sometime. Bring your own questions, not your mother's." He wrote back a thumbs up, which is what 19-year-olds do when they're feeling too much to use words. And I sat in my truck at the edge of the continent and watched the water try to climb the jetty and fall back, try and fall back. And I thought that maybe the only rescue that had ever really mattered was the one I was doing right then, with my thumbs on a phone, 200 miles from any ocean I'd ever jumped into. Wendell Pruitt and I had coffee before I left, at a diner on Marine Drive where the waitress called us both honey, and the coffee came before we asked. He told me about the 11 grandchildren. He showed me pictures on a phone he could barely operate, his big cracked thumb missing the photos and pulling up the calendar by accident. And I helped him, and we laughed. And it was the first easy thing I'd felt in weeks. He told me what he'd been saying, in the water. The thing I couldn't hear over the rotors in 2006. He'd worked it out later, in the hospital, what his own mouth had been doing while a stranger fought to get a strap around him. He'd been saying, "Let me go," over and over, not in fear, in what felt to him at the time like generosity. He had decided in the warm Langkokold that he was an old man and I was youngs, and the smart thing, the kind thing, was for me to save myself and leave him. "I was trying to do you a favor," he said, and shook his head at the man he'd been for those 11 minutes. "Drowning makes you stupid, and it dresses the stupid up as noble. That's the part that ought to scare people." I told him about my mother and Sam then. I hadn't planned to. I'd never told anyone. But he was the one person alive who knew exactly what that brown river had done, because he'd been in its big cousin and come back, and so I told him about the dog named Pal and the stick, and the boy who didn't fight, and Wendell listened the way only someone who's been to the bottom can listen, and when I finished he was quiet a long time. "Your mother spent 70 years thinking she let her brother go," he finally said, "and then she raised the one person on God's earth who never lets anybody go." He turned his coffee cup, a quarter turn on the saucer, a sailor's habit, squaring things. "She didn't leave you that money because you tricked her, honey. She left it to you because you were the answer to the question she'd been asking since she was 9. You were what she'd have given anything to be." Standing on that bank, he looked up. "Somebody should have told you that a long time ago, so I'm telling you now." And there it was, my mother's last clear question, the one she fell asleep on. "Then who says it to you?" She'd asked it about thank you. Wendell wasn't saying thank you. He was saying the other thing, the bigger thing, the thing I'd spent 51 years, and 300 rescues, and one dead brother I never met waiting to hear from someone in my own family, and never once got. He was saying, "I'm proud of you." It just took a stranger from the water to say it, because the people on the bank never could. Before I left, he put his hand over mine on the table, the hand of a man who'd been dead for a few minutes in 2006, and had decided, in the year since, to be relentlessly, stubbornly alive. "You didn't owe that room anything," he said. "Walking in. You know that? I know it now. Your sister." He shook his head, not in judgment. "Some people, the water's already got 'em, and they don't even know they're wet." I looked at him. The exact thing, the exact image. Said by a man who'd been in the actual water, to a woman who'd pulled him out of it. "Yeah," I said. "I'm starting to understand that." I drove home down 101 with the ocean on my right this time, the same gray and enormous and familiar, and somewhere around Tillamook, the rain finally came. The rain my shoulder had been promising all week, and I drove through it with the wipers going. And the heater on. And I thought about all the people I'd carried up out of the dark over 26 years. The ones who lived and the 2 who didn't. And I thought, for the first time in my life, that maybe the bravest thing I ever did wasn't a single one of those 11-minute swims. Maybe it was driving away from a parking lot in Astoria without reading a note out loud to a sister who would never, ever forgive me for the crime of being worth saving. Here is what I've learned, and it's the only sermon I'll give you, so bear with me. We are taught that respect is something you earn and then receive. That if you do enough, sacrifice enough, prove enough, the people who matter will finally see you and say the words, I'm proud of you. I was wrong about you. I see you now. I believed that for 30 years. I believed it down 100 cables into 100 dark seas. And it is. I have come to think the cruelest lie we tell each other, because it puts the verdict in someone else's mouth and then makes you spend your whole life waiting for them to open it. The truth is plainer and harder. Respect that it depends on someone else's permission isn't respect. It's a hostage situation you volunteered for. The only respect that holds in a storm is the kind you carry in your own chest. The kind that doesn't need a witness to stand up in a pavilion. The kind that would have been just as real if Wendell Pruitt had never walked through that door, and the whole room had agreed with my sister, and I'd driven home with nothing but the truth and the cold in my shoulder. That respect, the kind you carry, is also the only kind you can give to other people without it costing you anything. Once I stopped needing Lorraine to see me, I could finally see her. A tired woman on a riverbank, holding a story too heavy to put down, afraid that if I was worth saving, then she'd wasted 30 years being the smart one instead of the seen one. I don't hate her. I can't. I've held too many people in too much cold water to hate someone just for going under. And here's the harder half of the lesson. The one I didn't want because it implicates me. For 50 years, I let my family decide what I was worth, and then I spent those same 50 years quietly proving the verdict wrong where nobody could see. And I told myself that was humility. It wasn't. It was its own kind of vanity. The vanity of the martyr. The one who'd rather be secretly right than openly known. Real respect for another person means letting them see you clearly enough to be wrong about you out loud, so they have the chance to change their mind. I never gave Lorraine that chance. I gave her a closed door and a strong back, and a sister who showed up from up current, where nobody could watch her come. We built that wall together, she and I, brick for brick, over 30 years. I just held my half so quietly. I convinced myself I wasn't holding anything at all. So if you take one thing from a stranger telling you a story, don't disappear yourself in the name of being good. Being unseen is not the same as being humble, and being needed is not the same as being respected. And the people who love you cannot rise to meet a version of you that you've spent your whole life hiding. Let them see the medal in the drawer. Let them ask the hard question. Give them the chance to surprise you. Some of them won't. Lorraine didn't. But Tyler might, and the only reason he has the chance is that one old man from the water finally said out loud the thing my whole family spent a lifetime swallowing. A note before you go. The work in this story, Coast Guard rescue swimmers, the air station at the mouth of the Columbia, the cold water survival math, all of it is real, and the people who do it are real, and they are out there tonight, somewhere off a dark coast, while you and I are warm. If anything here made you think about that, the Coast Guard Foundation supports the families of those crews, and the 988 suicides, Chris' lifeline is reachable around the clock. For anyone fighting the kind of cold that doesn't come from the ocean. Because the warm, peaceful, give-up feeling isn't only something that happens in the water. I am not a counselor, and I am not a chaplain. I'm someone who spent 26 years learning that the person going under is very often the one fighting hardest against the hand that's trying to help. If you are the hand tonight, don't let go too early. And if you are the one in the water, let somebody reach you. The cold lies. It tells you rest is the safest peace. Take care of the people who quietly take care of you. And if there's a riverbank somewhere in your family, a story everyone's been holding for 30 years. You don't have to read the note out loud to win. Sometimes you just drive home in the rain, lighter than you came.